Welcome, everyone. It's so good to see so many of you here this morning or today. My name is Sam Sonata, and on behalf of the Living the Dharma Committee, I'd like to welcome you to our third seminar in our series on three poisons. I also wanted to, at this time, acknowledge the committee who has worked so diligently in presenting the seminars this year: Judy Kono, Deuce Nakano, Maya Lawrence, Ken Tanimoto, and of course, Bishop Reverend Harada. For those who have attended our previous seminars, welcome back. And for those attending for the first time, welcome. And we hope you enjoy the presentation. This will be our last seminar for 2022, but we are planning for more sessions in 2023. So please watch out for them via the newsletter and flyers. As mentioned, today's seminar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. You can find them on BCA, Center for Buddhist Education, or the Buddhist Churches of America. So please subscribe and like and share with your friends that are interested in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. For today's topic, finding the antidote to ignorance, we have two dynamic speakers. To introduce them is Reverend Marvin Harada, Bishop of the Buddhist Churches of America, and Sensei will also lead us in Gassho. Sensei?
Okay. Thank you very much, Sam. Join me in Gassho. We'll recite the Nembutsu. Naman Navats, 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 Naman Navats. Well, welcome to everyone many of you maybe have attended the previous sessions. Just a brief review, the first session on the poison of greed, I talked about greed. Then we had two sessions on anger. We had one with Larry Ward, who's from the Thich Nhat Hanh's organization. And then we also had Reverend Takashi Miyagi to speak about greed from a Shin Buddhist perspective. And today we're on the third of those three poisons, ignorance. And we want to kind of focus on ignorance as sort of a manifestation of manifested as prejudice and discrimination in the world today that we see so prevalent. And so we have two wonderful speakers. I'm going to introduce our first speaker at this time. Reverend Blaine Higa is the resident minister of the Kona Honganji Buddhist Temple located in Kealakekua, Hawaii. He holds a Master of Divinity from the Institute of Buddhist Studies with a focus on Shin Buddhist ministry and chaplaincy. He received Tokudo and Kyoshi from our Nishi Honganji. He serves as a chair on the Committee on Social Concerns for the Hawaii Kyodan, and also he's on the Ministerial Training Committee. So Reverend Blaine also serves on the board of American Civil Liberties Union of Hawaii and Vibrant Hawaii. I'm not sure what that is. Maybe he can explain. But we got to know Reverend Blaine when he was a student at IBS. And, you know, we all knew he was going to be just a tremendous minister. I know he's doing wonderful work in Hawaii. And so as our first speaker today to discuss this topic of ignorance, I'd like to now introduce Reverend Blaine Higa.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to Bishop Harada and the Living the Dharma Committee for your invitation to share with you today. You know, wherever you are on your spiritual journey, you are most welcome. We are truly fellow travelers spending this time together to deepen our understanding of and appreciation for the honest and life-giving teaching of Shin Buddhism, a path for those of us who are lost, confused, and struggling to make our way in the darkness of the world in which we live. And let me share my screen with you. Okay. maybe just a brief side note. So Vibrant Hawaii, which I sit on the board of, is a local nonprofit here on Hawaii Island that does community building and community resiliency building in the various communities on this island. So I'm actually very happy and proud to work with them on improving life here on the island. And so today we're going to briefly talk about the Jodo Shinshu Antidote to Ignorance. And so this image here, this illustration, how does it sum up the state of our world today? How does it reflect the nature of conflict that arises from our ego, from our pride, from our ignorance? Shakyamuni Buddha taught that the root cause of human suffering is our anger, our greed, our ignorance. And doesn't it seem like we've been drinking so much of these poisons in recent years? Doesn't it seem like from our politics, right, to the pandemic, to how we deal with just everyday life, it seems like we are being consumed by an endless cycle of suffering. And so we know that the three poisons continue to cause immense suffering in our lives. From the ongoing war in Ukraine is just one example of how powerfully destructive our ego can be when left unchecked. We are also contending with acts of political violence, like we've recently seen in the news, white supremacy, and racism as a nation. In a letter to his followers, Shinran Shonin, the founder of Jodo Shinshu, reflects on our capacity for unwholesome actions. And he says, human beings are such that, maddened by the passions of greed, we desire to possess. Maddened by the passions of anger, we hate that which should not be hated. Seeking to go against the law of cause and effect, led astray by the passions of ignorance, we do what should not even be thought. Shinran's very stark assessment of our human condition is quite revealing and quite remarkable for a spiritual leader. And so only when illuminated by Mida's light can our unexamined inner life be revealed and the darkness of the three poisons be neutralized. We must endeavor to listen deeply to the calling voice of wisdom and compassion, returning us home to our true selves. And Shinran further says in one of his wasan, his poems, ignorance and blind passions abound, pervading everywhere like innumerable particles of dust. Desires and hatred arising out of conflict and accord are like high peaks and mountain ridges. And so spiritual awakening is often described as a journey to the top of a mountain where we leave behind our attachments. However, in Buddhism, and in particular Shin Buddhism, our spiritual awakening occurs when we go into the valley of our lives, into the dark places that lie in the shadow of the mountains. This journey within is the heart of the Nembutsu path, of the Pure Land path. Only by going within do we discover our true self. In his major writing, the Kyogyo Shinshu, the teaching, practice, and realization, Shinran shares this concept of deep mind. Deep mind is a deeply entrusting mind. There are two aspects. One is to believe deeply and decidedly that you are a foolish being of karmic evil, caught in birth and death, ever sinking and ever wandering in transmigration from innumerable kalpas in the past, with never a condition that would lead to emancipation. The second is to believe deeply and decidedly that Amida, Buddha's 48 vows, grasps sentient beings, and that allowing yourself to be carried by the power of the vow, without any doubt or apprehension, you will attain birth. So this dual concept, this of deep mind, is critically important to Shinran's understanding of his relationship to Amida Buddha, to this dynamic working of wisdom and compassion of the universe, and how through this understanding arises awakening to our true self within the embrace of great wisdom and compassion. And so, Shinran realized that the spiritual journey to perfect awakening in the Pure Land was a journey through imperfection. Shin Buddhist scholar Dr. Taitetsu Uno once described the Pure Land path as taking place as descending into the valley, the shadows of the mountains. He believes that the valley and the shadows is where Shin's spirituality flourishes, because it is where we encounter the dynamic activity of Amida Buddha's wisdom and compassion. This metaphor illustrates Shinran's fundamental spiritual insight of imperfection and radical acceptance, which leads to a life of transformation, of healing, and ultimately of wisdom. Shinran's spiritual path was one of critical self-reflection about his own limitations as a human being. By awakening to the activity of perfect wisdom and compassion, working in his life. And so Shinran, in one of his other writings, shares this. In Gutoku's notes, the Shinjin of the wise is such that they are inwardly wise, outwardly foolish. The heart of Gutoku, of Shinran, is such that I am inwardly foolish and outwardly wise. Wow, pretty remarkable, yeah, when you think about how, we revere him as a great teacher and as a wise person, but he himself saw himself as ordinary and foolish and filled with these blind passions that we're discussing in this series of seminars. And when you think about it, haven't we been journeying through the valleys and the shadows of our lives over the past several years, in particular during this time of pandemic? So with this understanding, right, Shinran Shonin comes to accept himself as a foolish being, as one who is incapable of attaining enlightenment on his own. And so he entrusts into the dynamic working of Namo Amida Butsu, right? It is this radical acceptance of self that Shinran turns to the working of the Nembutsu, of Amida Buddha. So Namo Amida Butsu, right? Namo, I give up, I entrust Amida Butsu to a power beyond the self, that which is beyond this individual human being, right? My own life and the life that sustains me becomes one, right? The union of self and dynamic reality. Namo Amida Butsu. Right, the key concept for Shinran is that of the Bonbu, of a foolish being. This describes for him our fundamental nature as hopelessly burdened with karmic evil and our lack of capacity to attain liberation on our own. In one of his other writings, the Notes on Once Calling and Many Calling, Shinran describes foolish beings as none other than ourselves, who are full of ignorance and blind passion. Our desires are countless, and anger, wrath, jealousy, and envy are overwhelming, arising without pause to the very last moment of life. They do not cease or disappear or exhaust themselves. However, it is because of this glaring truth of imperfection that there is absolutely the possibility of transformation and healing. The awakening to one's own limitations and imperfections reveals to us our full humanness and helps us to go beyond the confines of our ego self. This realization transforms our fragmented perspective into a more wholesome and understanding, one which dissolves the separation between Amida, Buddha, and ourselves. Shin Buddhist ministers Shoji Matsumoto and Ruth Tabra believe, in the light of this wisdom, we begin to see the depths of our ignorance as to the nature of reality and as to the true nature of ourselves. We begin to be able to acknowledge that we have been seeing only those fragments of the real world and of ourselves that we choose to see. Spiritual distress is caused by our perception of separation and isolation from Amida, from each other. This is the Buddhist understanding of ignorance. This spiritual fragmentation leaves us deluded, disconnected, and disempowered, keeping us trapped in a cycle of suffering that we perpetuate time and time again. Professor Mark Uno described Shinran's spiritual awakening as, at the deepest level, Shinran, saw himself as the recipient of this gift of Dharma, rather than its dispenser. His true Buddhist identity came effectively into relief only in the solitary light of his own self-awareness. The truth of the self can only be seen when one is alone with the universe. It was in this realization of Dharma and enlightenment as a gift from Amida Buddha that Shinran saw his full humanness, and which served as a foundation for his life. In a similar fashion, can we ourselves own our brokenness and transform our imperfections into a source of compassion, of strength, and of healing? Shinran describes this amazing spiritual process in one of his wasan, his poems. He says, obstructions of karmic evil turn into virtues. It is like the relation of ice and water. The more the ice, the more the water. The more the obstructions, the more the virtues. This life of honest self-reflection and transformation is essential to understanding Shinran's view of human nature and of Shin Buddhist spirituality. How does this realization of imperfection function in our lives? How does Shin spirituality lead to a life of transformation and ultimately offer an antidote to ignorance? In his book, Tariki, Embracing Despair, Discovering Peace, Hiroyuki Itsuki reflects on this powerful insight into human nature. He says, Honen, Shinran's master, Shinran, and Renyo were very much aware of the weight of the personal karma that they each bore, their own foolishness, and the darkness in their hearts. This naturally led them to ask what such a person must do to live in the world and be saved in the Pure Land. This clear awareness of the dark aspects of human existence led to them to a knowledge of the light that illuminated them. We cannot know that we are illuminated by a great light simply by looking up into the sky. But if we lower our heads and look down at our feet, we can clearly see the long, dark shadow that stretches out from us. We know that the darker and blacker that shadow is, the brighter the light that shines upon us. Shinran and also Renyo told us to look at our own black shadow. And so according to Taitetsu Uno, this light of Amida Buddha not only illuminates our darkness, transforms it so that we try our best to be compassionate with a sense of humility and gratitude, mindful of our karmic limitations. Humility arises for having been shown our karma-bound self, yet grateful for the boundless compassion that inspires us to act with a new and vigorous appreciation for life. Uno's words aptly describes a Shin Buddhist spirituality of imperfection and how it can serve as a foundation for spiritual awakening. In what ways have we experienced this in our lives during this time of pandemic and political turmoil? The ultimate spiritual reality for Shinran is the realization that human beings are karmically burdened and limited in our capacity for attaining enlightenment, and thus are embraced by the compassionate activity of Amida Buddha. Shinran's spirituality thus relies upon Amida's power, which is beyond our limited ego self. This dynamic relationship between an individual and Amida Buddha is the heart of the Shin Buddhist path, which according to Dr. Takamoto Shigaraki, this is the structure of the deep mind. I'm able to know the dark shadow of my karmic evil only when I am immersed in the light of the Buddha's wisdom. And significantly, in the dark depths of my ego self, I encounter the light of wisdom for the first time. An example of this can be seen in this poem by Chiyono Sasaki, who was born in 1897 on the Big Island of Hawaii. She was a devout Shin Buddhist follower who demonstrated the free, open, and spontaneous life of Nembutsu, in which she owned her humanness and rejoiced in the embrace of the Buddha. And this poem comes from this book here, Dharma Treasures, which was done by Reverend Tatsuo Minato, a retired minister from Hawaii Kyodan. And the poem is this: when told that I was foolish, truly foolish, it was but the power of the primal vow that led me to fall. Rejoicing, I said, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. When I fell after being told to fall, I found myself on a lotus petal. I am ashamed of myself. I am sorry. Tears of joy come streaming down. The karmic burdens realized by Shinran are the fundamental imperfections we all share as human beings. He came to understand that these imperfections are an integral part of who we are and are inseparable from the activity of the sacred in our life. It is only because of our imperfections and the rough edges that the sacred exists and is able to embrace us fully. If our lives are perfectly smooth, there will be nothing for the sacred to grasp and hold on to. It is only when Shinran embraced uncertainty, realized his lack of control, and accepted his helplessness that his imperfections were transformed into the cause of spiritual awakening. It was only because Shinran had rough edges that Amida Buddha was able to grasp him and to hold on because of the gaping holes in his life that the Dharma had some place to fill. This radical acceptance of our imperfect selves is the essence of the Pure Land path. This is what it means to awaken to imperfection. This is what it means to dispel our ignorance of self. Zen priest Joan Sutherland shares the following insight into the ultimate religious experience of Buddhism. This resonates so deeply with how I understand Shin Buddhism and the way Amida Buddha embraces me. She says, perhaps enlightenment is that which comes toward us, a previously unimaginable grace, while awakening is that which arises inside us to prepare for and to meet the grace and to hold it once it's come. But as we know in Buddhism, suffering is caused by delusion, right? We delude ourselves to the reality of our own limited abilities. We think we are more perfect and more capable than we truly are, or that we are more right than somebody else. But ultimately, right, we delude ourselves by believing that we are not subject to the realities of old age, of sickness, of death. This truth of impermanence is our inherent fundamental imperfection, which we seek to deny. Realizing our ultimate powerlessness and overcoming imperfection is essential to spiritual awakening. In our struggle for perfection, we delude ourselves by denying all the things that make us less perfect. We obsess over the unattainable ideal of perfection, and we suffer as a result. When we give up this misguided struggle for perfection and accept all of our faults, all of our ugliness, our inadequacies, and limitations, we are able to then find wholeness by reclaiming our full humanness, like Shinran taught. It is this acceptance of imperfection which then becomes the foundation for healing. However, The realization of this truth is the hardest step because we cling so tightly to the belief that we are more perfect than we really are. True spirituality begins when we give up trust in our imperfect ego self and to realize that we are not alone in our spiritual struggle. It is only through this spiritual process of acknowledging and accepting our inherent flawedness where a Shin spirituality of imperfection is revealed and is realized. A central aspect of imperfection is the cultivation of empathy and compassion for self and others. Reverend Naoki Nabeshima believes that this is developed through an understanding of interdependence, which is a central tenet of Buddhism. Nabeshima says, all beings and all things are mutually connected beyond time and space. The sense of interdependence brings people to critically reflect on their egoism and engenders compassion for all other beings. Through the realization of interdependence, Buddhists have found a way to approach people's sorrows and sufferings. Here, empathy is cultivated through critical self-examination, in which we realize our own need for compassion. My seminary advisor, the Reverend Dr. Daijaku Kinst, suggests that we reflect our own need for hospitality and cultivate a posture of humility. This humility gives strength and supports empathy. The realization of our imperfections becomes the source of our awakening to compassion, working and through our own lives. Maybe dispelling the illusion of separateness is an antidote to the many conflicts that plague our lives. In another wasan, Shenran says, speaking of Amida Buddha, speaking of this Nembutsu path, it is a great torch in the long night of ignorance. Do not sorrow that your eyes of wisdom are dark. It is a ship on the vast ocean of birth and death. Do not grieve that your obstructions of karmic evil are heavy. In his book, Awaken to Your True Self, Dr. Hideo Yonezawa shares the profound story of a junior high school student and his friend. The story, entitled Failing is to Become Buddha, captures the essence of spiritual transformation based on a lived spirituality of imperfection and this process of deep hearing. The two boys take a high school entrance exam with the expectation that they would both pass. However, only one of the boys passed the exam, and the one who failed developed a deep anger and resentment toward his friend. One day, the friend came to see the boy who had failed, but the boy didn't want to see him because he thought his friend wanted to gloat over his failure. However, the boy's mom scolded him for his self-centered thinking and basically tells him to grow up. When the friend comes to the boy's room, he was crying and told the boy, "I am sorry that I was the only one to pass," covered his face and left. At that moment, the boy had a profound realization of his own conceit, his arrogance, his ignorance, and felt ashamed. In this story, the boy said the following: "When I realized that I was the one who had been conceited, I also realized that I deserved to fail. I realized that my friend was a different human being from me. How horrible it would have been if I had passed. I would have turned into a totally conceited human being. I deserved to fail. It was good that I failed. It was as if the heavens made me fail in order to make me become a human being." Although this was a most painful experience, I began to feel that with this experience, I could start over again. Until now, I had only thought that happiness meant that things went your way. But because of the lesson that I learned from my friend, sometimes when things don't go your way, that is a more important lesson for human beings. And Dr. Yonezawa reflects on the boy's transformation by saying, "Failure is completely transformed into becoming Buddha. This path is Namo Amida Butsu. For the young man who failed the entrance exam, the experience will allow him to understand the sadness of others who have failed. Now he is able to grasp the hands of those who have failed and who are less capable. They are the same as he, and his world is broadened. This is the awakening found in the deep mind of Shinjin, which transforms our imperfections into virtues. Dr. Shigaraki describes this process as, I am able to know the dark shadow of my karmic evil only when I'm immersed in the light of the Buddha's wisdom. And significantly, in the dark depths of my ego self, I encounter the light of wisdom for the first time. We are made to know our inner shadow through the outer light of wisdom and compassion that comes from Amida Buddha. Yonezawa describes the boy's experience as the world in which failure means to become Buddha is the Pure Land. Therefore, we need not fear failure. We need not fear the arising of our blind passions. We can be at peace in our world of delusion. This is the experience of hearing the name, of encountering the working of Namo Amida Butsu. Through the working of the vow, the boy was made to see his true self in the light of compassion. In this way, right, our humanness, our imperfections becomes our greatest teacher and healer. Owning our shadow heals our wounded selves, leaving the necessary scars of experience. Healing doesn't mean becoming perfect, but rather it means becoming more perfectly whole. Ultimately realizing our powerlessness and overcoming perfection is essential to our spiritual awakening. And however, realizing this truth is the hardest step because we cling so tightly to our greed, our anger, our ignorance. And so, like that image of the three poisons of the animals, each of them, right, is biting onto the tail of the other, right, in an endless cycle, feeding off of each other, right? Think about how that describes the world in which we are living. And so Dr. Shigaraki says, our everyday lives are truly humble and mean. Covered in the mud of defiled passions, our lives are of shadowy darkness. However, when we learn the Buddha Dharma, earnestly say the Nembutsu, and realize Shinjin, our lives of darkness change little by little into the pure, luminous life of the Buddha. This is transformation, or turning and becoming. The Buddha's teachings invite us to bravely engage life with all of its contradictions and all of its complexities. A wise and realistic hope can be cultivated when we embrace our imperfections and open our hearts to uncertainty and change. The Dharma is our lifeline as we dive into the ultimate groundlessness of our lives. Namo Amida Butsu connects us to the inconceivable life of the Buddha, reminding us that we are never alone in our struggle. This radical shift in perspective is the promise of the Dharma. The Buddha's teachings help us to understand and to manage life with greater kindness, compassion, and equanimity. In the Pure Land path of Shinran, Namo Amida Butsu is a promise from Amida Buddha to embrace, never to abandon. Namo Amida Butsu holds us in both our joys and our sorrows and transforms our ignorance into wisdom, our greed into generosity, and our anger into love. Namo Amida Butsu can help us to meet life's challenges skillfully with an open-hearted compassion and courage. This is the activity of wisdom unfolding as compassion, which transforms our brokenness into wholeness. In the notes on Essentials of Faith alone, Shinran describes the spiritual alchemy, which is catalyzed by Amida's compassion. He says, when we entrust ourselves to the Tathagata's primal vow, we who are like bits of tile and pebbles are turned to gold. When we begin to see ourselves in this way, our lives are nurtured and we become more fully aware of our true humanness. And little by little, embracing our full humanness then empowers us to live with humility, with gratitude, and compassion for self and others. Through deep self-reflection, we can transform our greed, our anger, and ignorance into the reason for our awakening. This is the everyday wisdom that the Buddha teaches, that pushes us to become more than our greed, more than our anger, more than our ignorance. We become more our fuller selves within the dynamic embrace of wisdom and compassion. This is awakening to imperfection, and it is the ultimate antidote to ignorance. So thank you very much for this time and for joining us today. I look forward to having a discussion with everybody.
Oh, thank you very much, Reverend Blaine. That was like a 30-minute, what is Shin Buddhism? That was one of the most concise, articulate ways of expressing, what is Shin Buddhism in like 30 minutes or less. That was really tremendous, how you brought in not only quotations from Shinran Shonin himself, but from other, contemporary teachers of varying backgrounds, and even I love the quote from the Zen Roshi as well. I just kind of wonder how we're all challenged by how to present Shin Buddhism to this, Western public as ministers, and the looking at the shadow, so the dark side. How do you think about using the well-known metaphor of Star Wars, the dark side, as a way of maybe articulating what is the Shin Buddhist spirituality?
Oh, absolutely, right. We're always in this conflict, right, between shadow and light, right? That there is this, but the thing is, there is no shadow without light, and there is no light without shadow, right? They arise simultaneously, right? I think Dr. Shigaraki talks about a lot in his own writings about this play between shadow and light, right? And these dynamic forces in our world, right? We see that within ourselves, right? So Star Wars, right? The dark side, the light. I mean, it's very much, right, this contemporary, kind of pop culture metaphor, right, for right our spiritual lives, right, for our humanness. I think aside from just being a fun experience to watch and to but to kind of struggle, right, that human struggle between light and dark, right? That's our eternal struggle, right, of our own self, right, of our deepest held beliefs, our deepest held essence of who we are, right? We're always, right, there's this discussion about we can either be a Hitler or a Mother Teresa, right? Right, within ourselves, we have the capacity for great compassion, great love, great joy, but we also have the exact opposite, right? For harm, for hurt, for destruction, right? So being mindful of that, living this life, that's what the Dharma teaches us, right? To look deeply at our own selves, at our motivations and who we are, and then allows us to hopefully make better choices, and to live a little bit more with a little more clarity about who we are.
Yes, thank you. I'd be happy to take a question or two from the chat if someone would like to present a question to Reverend Blaine at this point in time. There will be also some time at the end. We'll have sort of open discussion with Chenxing Han and Reverend Blaine. But let's see, is there... Okay, if not, let me also kind of follow on that same train of thought. It seems like when people watch Star Wars, they think that the dark side, people always just kind of look at the sort of moral ethical side. Oh yeah, I should be a better person, and not see how Shin Buddhism is trying to get us to sort of accept, even our negative side, see our ego side. I wonder how we can present that to the West, where it's not just this moral ethical side when we talk about the dark side. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, right. It's this acknowledgement of our deepest selves, the self, the part of us that we don't want to acknowledge, right? We all have, impure thoughts or less than charitable or wholesome thoughts, and right. The Buddha talks about how, right, we create the world, and the world is created through our minds, right? And so this idea, right, of the dark side is ever present within us, right? And that's what Shinran's asking us to look at, right? He himself saw himself, right, in this, as someone who was karmically burdened, someone who was incapable, someone who was, has a mind of snakes and scorpions, right? In one of his writings, that really honest, critical self-assessment is very refreshing, but also very difficult, because we all don't want to see that, right? And especially in America, we don't want to see that aspect of ourselves, right? Our American culture kind of glosses over these types of things in our lives, right? Look at our advertising, look at just the way things are presented in our world today, in American culture. We need to kind of strip away, right, some of that illusion or that delusion, right, to look at the heart of who we are, right, in a more honest and a more compassionate way, right? I think that's what Shin Buddhism offers, right? It is that understanding of self, which is held, right, within compassion. That's why the deep mind that Shinran talks about, right? We know that we are karmically burdened, but yet, and because of that, we are embraced by great wisdom and compassion, right? That is the totality of our spiritual experience and how we should entrust, right? And that black and white, there isn't just black and white, right, in our world. There's shades of gray. Right? Very few things in this world are black and white. And how do we hold space and allow for complexity, allow for contradiction, allow for, just being human, to be more real. So.
Yes. Victoria and Rick mentioned in the chat, the problem with the Star Wars image is that people are portrayed as black or white, good is fighting evil and separate individuals, but reality is that we are both, all of us, even the soldiers of rebellion. So instead of the forces of good versus evil, that it's within us. I think she was bringing out what you said. There's a really good something from the quote from Pamela that says, would it be fair to say in Shin, there's nothing for us to do but wake up?
But isn't that the hardest thing to do, though?
Yeah, that's the hardest thing to do. Yeah. Yes, that's all we have to do is wake up, but how to wake up is the great question. Okay, we'll maybe entertain some more questions after we hear from Chenxing. But for now, I'd like to thank Reverend Blaine again for that wonderful presentation. And I'd like to move on to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Chenxing Han, who is the author of the book Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists, which is this book here. And she has another book she's working on titled One Long Listening, a memoir of grief, friendship, and spiritual care. Chenxing holds a BA from Stanford University and an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union, and her certificate in Buddhist chaplaincy from our Institute of Buddhist Studies. She is a co-teacher of Listening to the Buddhists in Our Backyard at Phillips Academy, Andover, and is a co-organizer of the May We Gather event, a National Buddhist Memorial for Asian American ancestors that maybe some of you saw about a year ago. It was a tremendous event. So I'd like to turn it over now to Chenxing Han.
Thank you so much, Bishop Harada. I'm going to speak to gallery view so I can see some of you and not just myself. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. Thank you to all of you for being present, to the Living the Dharma Committee for this really, truly humbling opportunity to speak with all of you. I come to you as sort of a fellow student of the Dharma. I myself am a layperson who was not raised Buddhist, as I talk about a little bit in my book, Be the Refuge, which is a book based on interviews with about 89 young adult Asian American Buddhists from different backgrounds. And this topic today, wow, Buddhist antidotes to racial prejudice and discrimination. Just have half an hour, but I thought maybe we could actually begin by, if you feel comfortable, closing your eyes and just reflecting on a time, remembering a time maybe recently where you really listened. Maybe you really listened to someone or something. Maybe it was just nature around you. Maybe it was the sound of a city, car horns. Just take a moment to remember that time of really listening. And maybe just notice how you feel in your body, even just to remember what it feels like to listen. Do you notice you doing anything differently in your body? Do you notice different feelings, sensations that come up? And now I'll invite you to remember a time when someone really listened to you. Just really listened deeply, really listened attentively, with a lot of care. What did it feel like to be really listened, maybe really heard? And just notice how that feels now in our bodies. And if we could be together more in person or more interactively, I would wish we could turn to each other, to a partner, and now share, listen to each other. But thank you for taking that moment to enter with listening. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Take a moment to share my screen. So earlier this month, I was able to help out with a class called Buddhism in the Bay Area. It's being taught by Trent, who's in the blue shirt here, who is my husband. He's a postdoc at Stanford, and he's been leading a group of students to explore and visit different Buddhist temples in the Bay Area. So they're also reading on campus, but they're able to very unusually go off campus and listen to some of the local Buddhists. And the very first field trip they went to was, as maybe some of you will recognize, was the San Mateo Buddhist Temple, which is actually very close to Stanford campus. And I believe for all of these students, it was certainly their first times at a BCA temple, at a Shin Buddhist temple. And for many, it was their first times at a Buddhist temple at all. And this was maybe few weeks ago, and I still hear the students reflecting on how powerful it was to have this experience, to be able to hear the Dharma live. And we went on a very special occasion. Saint Bishop Harada was there speaking, and Bevan Matsumoto was getting becoming a certified minister's assistant. So we were able to witness this ritual together. This is a very special occasion. And I don't know if you can see, there's a picture of a board in this corner. Bishop Harada gave this really wonderful Dharma talk for the children that I think all the adults very thoroughly enjoyed. We got to paint Chinese letters and Japanese characters in the air all together. And the first character that Bishop Harada helped us learn was the Nembutsu. In Chinese, this looks like Nianfo. And this is actually something I've been wanting to tell Bishop Harada via email. So I'm very happy I get to tell you actually in sort of person, I guess, over Zoom. But you had mentioned that this character for reminded you of something else, a dollar sign. And what's quite remarkable is after your talk that our students carefully listened to, one of our students who grew up partly in Korea and in the US said, oh, well, actually in Korea, when we refer to dollars, instead of saying dollars, we'll actually say bul, which means Buddha. And it's precisely for this, this like actual, resemblance of this bull character and the dollar sign. And it was just kind of like, wow, that was quite an astounding moment, I thought. And I asked her, when they had started doing that. She's like, oh, my grandma even says that. So I think it's been happening for some time now. So anyway, I was reflecting on this when invited to speak on this topic and feeling, to be honest, quite daunted by the magnitude of this Buddhist antidotes to racial prejudice and discrimination. It's such a broad topic. Where do we begin? And then something about this little anecdote helps me remember, oh, Buddhism is just really, truly a wealth of resources, if you will. And actually, if we listen carefully and listen deeply and attentively with care, we'll find it in many places. And I myself am, I would say, a non-sectarian Buddhist, although Jodo Shinshu has been very much something that's shaped my life very deeply, but as well other Theravada and Mahayana Buddhist traditions. So in my talk today, I'll share a little bit from different traditions. I think many of us have heard this expression, thus have I heard, 如是我闻, nyose gamon. And this is a way that many Buddhist sutras, stories, texts are often introduced. And while reflecting on this theme of antidotes to racial prejudice and discrimination, I thought about 3 Buddhist stories, about 3 particular Buddhist characters that have often really spoken to me, that I think have resonated, and not just with me, but with many people. The first being Kisa Gotami. I know I've heard this story at BCA temples, as well as at insight communities and many other Buddhist spaces as well. It comes from the Therigatha commentary, the Therigatha being, sometimes it's translated as verses of the elder nuns and considered one of the first pieces of spiritual writing by religious women. So this is a really incredible collection. There are many translations. Charles Hallisey's translation is very beautiful and freely available of the Therigatha. In the story, as it goes, there was a woman named Gotami, and in fact, she came from a very poor family. They even called her Skinny Gotami because she was so thin. And when she was finally able to marry a wealthier older man, the family just ridiculed her. Oh, she's just this daughter of a poor family. And it was only really once she had a son that they started to treat her with some respect. But very tragically, the son at a young age died. And Kisa Gotami just went mad with grief. She was so bereft at the death of her son. And she started going from door to door and just saying, do you have medicine? Do you have medicine to bring him back to life? And actually, many people just further ridiculed her, like, are you ridiculous? There's no such medicine. So going from door to door, here she is, clutching this corpse of her son. And then finally, a wise man really took compassion on Kisa Gotami and thought, I think the Buddha has medicine that will help Kisa Gotami. And he sends her to the Buddha. And the Buddha sees her state and he says, oh, well, can you just bring me back some mustard seeds, just at any house where they have not experienced death, where death has not befallen this home, just bring me a mustard seed. Of course, Kisa Gotami probably thinks this is so easy. This is the cheapest possible spice or seed. So she goes to a house and asks for a mustard seed. I was like, oh yeah, of course we have mustard seeds. Oh, but have you known death in your family? Oh, of course we have. So people talk about that. And she realizes, oh, well, your mustard seed is no good for me. And she goes from door to door and quickly realizes, as Reverend Blaine so beautifully just taught us, this truth of impermanence, that we're all subject to death and impermanence. And in that moment, that she has this moment of awakening and she's able to let go. She takes her son to a charnel ground, she buries her son, and then she takes refuge in Buddhism. Eventually, she becomes enlightened. And every time I hear this story or read about it or hear someone else tell it, something new stands out to me. And this time, while preparing for this talk, I was just really struck by the wise man and the Buddha's compassion, how even though Kisagotami is out of her mind, how for so many people it's easy to shut the door or kind of other her and say, she's crazy, I don't even want to deal with this. But instead, they really faced particularly the grief, the deep pain that she was just consumed by, right? And for me, this gives us a kind of model for taking something as daunting as racial prejudice and discrimination. It gives us a reminder that even though it can be very difficult, first just confronting it, not pretending it doesn't exist in small ways, in big ways, in daily ways, in historical ways, in present day ways. You know, I think about Vincent Chin, the murder of Vincent Chin. I think about the murder of Emmett Till. And I think how in these cases, mothers' love for their murdered children actually sparked national movements to think about racial justice, what that looked like. And so there's too a power in grief. I think sometimes we flinch from it because we can want to fix it right away, very quickly, or because it just feels overwhelming. Maybe we flinch from it because it brings up grief in ourselves and it's uncomfortable to be with that. So this beautiful story of Kisagotami. And here again, I wish we could be in a workshop and gather into small groups and share with each other what this story brings up for us. But I think that she's such a powerful figure in the Buddhist literature. And then I think of the story of Angulimala, one of my personal favorites. Anguli means fingers and mala means garlands. And so you can maybe kind of see from this image, Angulimala is wearing a necklace out of the fingers of the people he's murdered. So this, generally speaking, might be a little less relatable than Kisagotami, or we maybe don't so much see ourselves in this mass murderer. And this story is actually found in Pali, in the Theravada Buddhist canon, but also in Sanskrit and in Tibetan and Chinese Buddhist texts that come from the Sanskrit. And this is such a powerful image, you know. What's really interesting to me in the Pali canon, in the Theravada Buddhist story, we don't get too much of the backstory of Angulimala. We're not really sure, why is he out here being a mass murderer? And why is he about to kill the Buddha? That's sort of like where we begin the scene with this bandit, and the Buddha is just walking and people are saying, no, 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 don't go this way. There's this mass murderer, this bandit, it is very dangerous, just avoid. And you know, the Buddha is not afraid and he just keeps going. And in the iconic scene of the story, Angulimala he needs one more garland. He's about to complete 1,000 fingers. And so he decides, I'm going to kill the Buddha. And so he's trying to race to the Buddha. He's like running and trying to catch the Buddha. And Angulimala is really fit. He can catch deer and cows. He can just catch, he's super fast. But the Buddha actually stops. And Angulimala is running, and Angulimala is saying, "Stop, stop!" And so in this scene, so the Buddha continues walking actually, and Angulimala. It's very confusing. Okay, so imagine, so Angulimala actually stops because he's not able to chase the Buddha, and the Buddha keeps walking, and Angulimala says, "Wait, stop, stop!" And the Buddha says, "I have stopped. You stop." And Angulimala gets really confused. He's like, okay, this is a member of the Shakya clan and they speak the truth, but he's walking and he says he's stopped and I've stopped, but he's telling me to stop. Like, what is going on? So he has this moment of just like, he's completely baffled. What is going on, right? And he realizes, as the Buddha explains to him, I have stopped violence. I have had a complete cessation of violence in body, speech, mind, we can think about. And here, Angulimala, though he's physically not moving, he has these intentions or thoughts to kill the Buddha, so he has not stopped violence. And so this is sort of Angulimala's moment of conversion or spiritual transformation. He takes refuge in the Buddha, and eventually he becomes a disciple of the Buddha. And what's really interesting is a few months ago, I read this story with a group of friends, and we read both the English translation from the Pali, and then also we looked at the Chinese Buddhist text. And the Chinese Buddhist text actually gives us quite a lot more background story for Angulimala, which I find really interesting. So we learned that actually he was a really bright young man, and he had a teacher, and actually his fellow students got jealous. Kind of makes me think of the story that Reverend Blaine was sharing with us about, this two students, the one feeling quite envious of the other. So Angulimala's fellow students got envious of him and turned him against their teacher. And then the teacher actually is the one who then, kind of with this intention to kill Angulimala, sent him on this very dangerous mission to collect 1,000 fingers. And so suddenly the whole story becomes even more complex. We realize that maybe the roots and seeds of his violence aren't just in himself, right? It's actually interdependent and interrelationally, causally linked. And I think for racial discrimination and violence, as much as in our individualistic American society, we might want to pin it on one person, if we take a step back and think about the broader societal conditions or the causal conditions, suddenly maybe a little bit of even empathy arises for Angulimala. And in the image we're looking at here, we actually see Angulimala's mother. We learn in the Chinese version of the story that the 1,000th person he wants to kill is his mother. And matricide, patricide are deep, deep sins in Buddhism. And the Buddha actually, out of compassion, wants to save Angulimala from the karma, the terrible karma that this action would cause. And so that's when he presents himself as perhaps a kind of bait for Angulimala. And it's also very beautiful in the Chinese. We get a bit more of the after story, sort of what happens when this mass murderer converts and he goes out on alms rounds. And of course, some villagers are extremely upset, understandably so. And sometimes I think one could almost read this as a story of restorative justice. There's times when the villagers are, harassing Angulimala or pelting him, and the Buddha is saying, I'm sorry, like this is your karma, this has come to you, this is the results of your actions. But there's a particularly beautiful moment where Angulimala actually helps a woman through a difficult childbirth. In a way, he saves the mother and the baby. And the way he's able to save them is through an act of truth, by speaking an act of truth. And so there's just this poetry to this whole story, right? Like that someone who almost murdered his own mother actually helps another woman give birth. So in a way, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, Angulimala is often seen as a kind of patron saint of childbirth, which, I find really moving. It's so unexpected from this story. And one thing that really stuck with me when I was reading the Chinese story was the word when the Buddha said stop was 住, which in colloquial Chinese literally just means to live. Like, I live in El Cerrito, 我住在 El Cerrito. And that really struck me that sometimes to stop, we have this in English too, right? Stay, I stay somewhere. And to stay ourselves means to stop. So what does it look like? What does pausing or stopping racial discrimination look like? What does that feel like in our bodies? That's a big question, but sometimes I think a simpler question is, what does stopping to really listen to someone look like? Or what does it feel like when someone really stops and listens to us? I think actually sometimes that space can feel like a refuge, can feel like a home. It can feel like a place we want to stay in, a place we want to dwell. And so to me, part of finding the antidotes to these certain forms of violence and ignorance in our lives looks a bit like asking ourselves on a very micro level, what does it look like when we're really listening to ourselves, to our families, to our neighbors, to our friends, right? Maybe that's a seed. I mean, for Angulimala, just that moment, that stopping moment was so profound. It was his first time experiencing a taste of what it looked like to stop this sort of pattern and habit of violence that had kept perpetuating this samsara, this endless cycle, to stop. And so those moments of pause and stop, I think we can never underestimate the power of those. And so for the third story I'll share is, some of you may have heard this story as well, from the Lotus Sutra in chapter 20. I found this on the website, a website oriented by the Soka Gakkai community, who takes the Lotus Sutra as their sacred, their most sacred and revered object of devotion. And this is for kids. So I haven't really seen too many depictions of this bodhisattva, and I won't read it all here, but at the core of this chapter of the Lotus Sutra is a bodhisattva who every time he encountered a person would just bow to them and say, I would never disparage you, for you are practicing the Buddha way, and all of you will become Buddhas. So this beautiful seeing the goodness in other people, the potential. And then as one can imagine, this is not really normal behavior, and it's met with many different reactions, right? In the Japanese Jōfukyo Busatsu Hon, or Buching Pusat Ting. So Buching is like not disparaging, which literally, I guess, translates to not light. In other words, like not holding other people with a kind of like, not slighting them, not seeing them lightly. I think like, to me, it's like really cherishing the kind of complexity, as Reverend Blaine was talking about, of each of us in our full humanity. And what has always struck me about this story is the way that some people will be very moved by, oh, wow, I've really just been acknowledged in this beautiful way. And yeah, I want to bow back. I want to honor and feel grateful in return, like maybe some gratitude or kindness arises. But some people actually get angry or violent, like, are you making fun of me? Or like, why are you saying that to me? And like, I didn't ask you to worship me. Or some of them even are throwing rocks and sticks. But nonetheless, Bodhisattva, never disparaging, just perseveres in this practice out of this deep belief that everyone is a bodhisattva. Everyone has Buddha nature. Everyone can become awakened and enlightened. And then we learn eventually that Bodhisattva, never disparaging, was actually Shakyamuni himself, but in a previous life. So reflecting on this trio of stories of Buddhist figures, I think there are, again, so many ways we can interpret these stories. I think part of the beauty of Buddhist stories is that we can, like any good story, return to it again and again, and we'll notice something different. It'll speak to us in this moment in our lives. Maybe there's certain challenges we're dealing with, or maybe there's certain joys we want to celebrate that we see reflected in these stories. I think generally, it's very tempting to see ignorance and discrimination as something other people out there do. I mean, guilty as charged, right? It's a lot more comfortable to see imperfections in others than to embrace our own. And Blayne, I'm just so moved by your Dharma talk on really, I think, embracing the gift of impermanence in a kind of deep way, and having some patience to see how those gifts of impermanence eventually do blossom. So I think that these trio of stories can feel a little bit heavy or serious. We can see them that way. You know, we're talking about the death of a child, we're talking about murder, we're talking about actually, and how do you sustain even violence from others without ever becoming violent oneself, instead just continuing to bow and honor the goodness in others. You know, so we could see them in that sense as being very serious. But actually in all of these stories, I also detect a sense of playfulness, of humor, a teasing element. And I think actually there are a lot of Buddhist stories have this kind of sense of humor. And it can be, for me, important to remember that, especially when in the popular culture, people can think of Buddhism as being so dour or just being too serious or even nihilistic. But I think quite the contrary. These Buddhist stories have almost an element of play and performance and theater in them. You know, in Kisagotami's story with the mustard seed, I think I see that mustard seed as a kind of loving challenge from the Buddha to Kisagotami. He didn't just say, oh, all things are impermanent. I think he realized it's almost like she needed to play a game, and she needed to fail at that game because she was never going to find those mustard seeds. You know, I think about in the Angulimala story, that moment where he's so baffled is actually kind of funny, right? There's a sort of playfulness, there's a comical element to him being stopped and just stopped right in his tracks. It's never been done before. So in a way, he's also failed at his mission, at his quest. But that moment of failure also opens up a whole realm of, well, awakening, of seeing the truth of our deep humanity. And I think of Bodhisattva, never disparaging, almost like in their present day would be like a performance artist, maybe, right? And he's almost like a mirror. He's mirroring to other people what that kind of being met with that kind of grace, with that kind of compassion brings up in people. Maybe some people think they're not worthy, and that's why the violent reaction comes up. But there's in that too a sort of playfulness as well. And so this just has me thinking about, I think for Buddhism is such a rich resource for us for thinking about nonviolent and creative and maybe even playful ways to address racial prejudice and discrimination. Just remembering it doesn't always have to be super serious, and it doesn't always have to be such a strain that we don't have to do it from a place of being on our moral high horses, right? That actually maybe there's ways that addressing the harms we see in the world can be life-giving, can be joyful, can actually connect us more deeply to others. So having talked about these stories, I thought, well, what are some maybe more modern day examples of Buddhists working collectively to address racial discrimination and violence? Actually, I think there are really many. So this is just a few small examples that came to mind. So in June 2020, for example, a group of people organized a Buddhists for Black Lives Matter march in Los Angeles. One of their organizers is here, who's my friend, Reverend David Wu, who's at the University of the West as a seminarian, and he also works for Homeboy Industries, a really incredible nonprofit in LA that works with people in that works with former gang members and people recovering from drug use. And so the group that David's a part of is called Burning Pride Meditation. It's actually a group of Asian American Buddhists in recovery, also allies. And so it's really extraordinary that they were able to organize this march of 500 plus people in downtown LA. And to me, the seed for this event also just came from, I think, listening, from really reading the news, hearing how people are so affected, the murders of Black people at the lives of police officers, and then in an ongoing way, these unjust deaths, and wanting to unite in a show of solidarity and compassion, right? And this is one moment, this was one day, and it took so much effort to have it come to fruition. And though it was now 2 years in the past, you know, even though I wasn't sadly able to participate, just knowing that this event happened, I think it planted a seed, and I think it had reverberations. So here's just one example where people were united in walking, in silence, in prayer, in ritual, all of these incredible resources that we have in the Buddhist tradition to come together. I know some of you were probably familiar with May We Gather. It's a Buddhist memorial ceremony that myself and Reverend Duncan Williams and Suni Su put together after the Atlanta shootings in March 2021. So a little more than a year ago now. And I'll just show some images. I know some of you will be familiar, and there's a video at our website, maywegather.org. But similarly too, this was us thinking about what is a Buddhist response, particularly one that centers Asian Americans, to this rising tide of anti-Asian violence in the wake of vandalism of Buddhist temples. So after Higashi Honganji Temple in Los Angeles had been vandalized, we decided to hold the event there and had an altar where we were able to acknowledge not just Asian American Buddhists of the past and historically who've been the victims, who've been killed by racial and religious animus, but also really all beings of any racial or religious background who have lost their lives to this kind of violence. Again, understanding the interconnected roots that give rise to this kind of violence. And I think about how we had speakers from different Buddhist and different racial and ethnic backgrounds speak on the 6 paramitas, kind of perfections within Buddhism. So Bishop Noriaki Ito talked about prajna, or wisdom. And he's of course the bishop of our host temple, Higashi Honganji. Sister Gingyam of the Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition of Deer Park spoke of sila, or ethics. Bhante Sanatavihari of the Sarat Chandra Buddhist Center, also in LA, he gave his talk in Spanish, and he talked about kshanti, or patience. I think Bodhisattva never disparaging is probably a perfection of patience. That Bishop Nyoke King Barrett of Nichiren Buddhist Temple in Texas talked about dhyana, meditation. Reverend Christina Moon of Daihon Zancho Zenji Temple in Hawaii talked about virya, kind of spiritual strength. And then finally, Dr. Larry Ward, who I spoke last time, he talked on dana and generosity. And central to this event was the image of a lotus. So when I think about the wealth of resources within Buddhism we can draw on, there's also so many images and metaphors that I think are, more than appears to the eye. When I lived in Cambodia, when Trent and I lived in Cambodia, we would often go to the local temple and people would offer lotus buds at the temples. So lotuses in Buddhism, throughout many Buddhist traditions, are the symbol of awakening, of purity and awakening. And what's powerful is that they can only grow in muddy waters, right? It's sort of true. Just last week, we were visiting a Vietnamese Buddhist nunnery in San Jose with the Buddhism in the Bay Area class. And a nun was reminding us of how precious this human rebirth is in their cosmology there. She's saying, it's better than being born in the realm of the gods or in the realm of the animals, and so if we think, okay, in the animals, I can think that makes sense. If we're hungry all the time or trying to avoid being killed by other animals or trying to stay safe, there's not a lot of capacity for spiritual transformation per se. And then in the realm of the gods, though, it's that sounds pretty nice. Everything's really perfect, right? Why not be there? But she reminded us well, actually, there's not quite enough imperfection. There's not quite enough suffering or anything to arouse our compassion. It's just really comfortable there. I think of the Buddha's own life story of hanging out in the heavens for a long time and having the gods have to nudge him, saying hey, you need to awaken. You need to spread some really important teachings to people. So don't just hang out here in this blissful state. It's okay. And going down to this human realm. So to me, the lotus is actually such a hopeful symbol because, who doesn't wish their lives were more perfect or they were more perfect? I think that's maybe inevitable. But if there's a way to remember that, imperfections can transform, but that we probably will never be able to cease racial prejudice and discrimination forever. And yet we will still continue to strive. And I think it's in that kind of tension and paradox where the creativity can happen, these kind of nonviolent and even playful responses. So at May We Gather, we took this lotus and you'll notice that it has cracks in it. And for us, these cracks symbolize these violences, the pain, the harm of particularly racial and religious discrimination and violence in this country, whose roots sadly go very deep. But we asked people to paint these cracks in the Japanese art of kintsugi, or gold joinery repair, where if a piece of pottery breaks, instead of throwing the pieces away, which is maybe something that is tempting to do, I'll just buy a new one, just sweep it under the rug, the brokenness. Instead, kintsugi reminds us that we can actually take these broken pieces, very carefully glue them back together, and instead of hiding the cracks, we can gild them, make them even more beautiful. And to me, that's a kind of powerful metaphor for how to name and honor and remember histories of violence, remember ongoing violence. And through that kind of storytelling, through that kind of remembrance, actually something much more beautiful can emerge. There's something very hopeful about that act of coming together in community. So on our altar, this act of naming was very important, of saying the names of people whose lives have been lost due to racial and religious animus. While I was thinking of that, I thought of Claudia Rankine's very powerful book, Citizen, and was thinking about my copy of the book, which I bought a few years ago now. I think in the beginning, it tells me this is probably the 11th print run of it. I'm sure it's on to a further print run. But on page 134, you can kind of see it here. She has a list of Black people who've been murdered. It begins in memory of Jordan Russell Davis, in memory of Eric Gardner, in memory of John Crawford, and so forth. And what really, broke my heart and gave me chills was her saying, in every edition of the book, this list gets longer, right? And so there's a heartbreak to that, knowing that every further reprint, there will be, sadly, more names. And yet naming them and knowing all these people were children, were spouses, were siblings, were beloved people. We remember them, and we hope from this remembrance that I think it can give us a kind of sense of maybe even spiritual urgency to remember that our spiritual lives are not separate from just our lives as humans, as political beings, or as social beings in the everyday world. And on this theme of naming, I think maybe also many of you here may know about Duncan Williams' project that he's working on now. It's called Ire, National Monument for the World War II Japanese American Incarceration. So there's three aspects to this, but what you see here is the opening ceremony for the Ireicho, and it's a sacred book of names. And it's the first time we have the names of every single one of the more than 125,000 incarcerees during World War II. And so as you can imagine, this is a monumental effort. You can visit this at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. If you make an appointment, as the Janam hopes that people will do, you can go and stamp your name next to one of the people. And the hope is that 125,000 people will visit so that we can mark and honor and name each of these individuals. So just to close, I wanted to share just a little bit about this ongoing project that I'm a part of called Listening to the Buddhists in Our Backyard. And this project came out is based out of Phillips Academy Andover High School in Andover, Massachusetts. And, it came about kind of somewhat unexpectedly, but one of the teachers there reached out to me after reading Be the Refuge and just said, I've been teaching Buddhism for 12 years. This is my co-teacher, Andy Huzio. And he said, I've so focused on the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path, and these are very important, but I want to find a way to teach Buddhism that's not just in textbooks, or doesn't just say Buddhism is only in Asia, that really honors the living Asian American Buddhist traditions here and now. And we realized right there in the Merrimack Valley, there were easily a dozen different Buddhist temples: Cambodian, Vietnamese, Lao, Thai. There's a Nichiren temple, a Chinese temple. And so as part of our learning together, the students were actually able to drop all their usual classes. So we had, very fortunately, 11 weeks to just really delve into local Buddhism, to listen to the Buddhists in our very backyards and to visit these different temples. So here's just one image from one of the temples. And so and then in sort of a similar way that I began this project, these high school students have been my teachers. The local Buddhists at these temples have very much been my Buddhist family, also my teachers, these unexpected Buddhist kin from different backgrounds. As we listened together very closely, and something we would do that I like to share with people, we would practice a very simple exercise, seemingly simple. It's called See, Think, Wonder, or I like to call it Sense, Think, Wonder. And it just involves going to space and first just noticing, what do we see? What do we sense? And then, oh, what does this make me think about? Like, when a student said, oh, this tea reminds me of my grandmother's house in Japan, right? So that's a thought that came to mind after she sensed and smelled the tea. And then there's a wondering. We start asking questions. Who comes to this temple? Oh, what are these little slips of paper for? These fortunes here in the corner. Oh, they're actually New Year's blessings. So the See, Think, Wonder exercise, I think, is really something that can help us slow down. Sometimes our judgments and our thoughts and our observations, they all get really entangled, but practicing a kind of slowing down and just taking in the environment. So I guess to end, I just want to offer that I think for Buddhism, there's a kind of reminder that, if we're going to find the antidotes to racial violence and discrimination, these hugely vast phenomena in our world, unfortunately, it's probably not something like, getting just something that we can do once and it's like, oh, okay, good, I took care of that. We're done here. I think there's a way in which Buddhism invites us into dailiness of practice. It's something that I think the Nembutsu moves me so much, right? Maybe you could interpret the sutras as saying, oh, if I just say it once, I'm in the Pure Lands, I'm good, right? But no, out of gratitude or out of a sense, of interconnectedness, we repeat it. And we do that because we're moved to do so. And so too, I think, again, how can we find ways in our lives where we're just moved to respond to suffering, and to also make sure to do it in a way where we're not wearing ourselves out, right? Do it in a way where we make sure it's sustainable for us. And I think so much of that begins just with listening, just to those right here, right where we are, right in this very moment. So thank you all so much for your listening.
Oh, thank you so much, Chenxing. That was such a tremendous presentation, and thanks for sharing those three stories. I mean, as a minister, I've talked about Kisago Tommy, many times at funerals and memorial services, and Angulimala. I've used that in study classes, but I learned so much from the way you explained it today and the background on it. That part, the Angulimala's stopping. Or like if we put that in today's words, if we could just hit the pause button. And doesn't that apply to all three of the poisons?
Yeah.
Like someone who, when we're angry, if we could just hit the pause button for, like Thich Nhat Hanh says, take a couple of deep breaths. Or someone who's, really, they're into drugs. If they could just hit the pause button and stop for just a little bit. Oh, this is what it feels like not to be on drugs.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the step to their recovery and in ignorance too, in the midst of feeling hatred and anger towards another opposite political group or ethnic group. If we could just hit the pause button. Oh, so I thought that was so tremendous what you shared about Angulimala and Kisago Tommy, all three stories. It was just tremendous. And thanks, I'm glad you shared about the May We Gather event as well, which was so moving. And Reverend Blaine was a part of the Irecho dedication ceremony as well. If someone wants to ask a question on the chat for Chenxing, I would welcome that, and then we're gonna have sort of a three-way little discussion too. So, well, maybe first, why don't you, Judy, if you could just go ahead and spotlight Reverend Blaine, and Chenxing had an opportunity to hear Reverend Blaine and made some comments on his presentation and her talk, but maybe Reverend Blaine, maybe you have some thoughts and comments on hearing Chenxing today, or if you have a question or comment you'd like to present to her.
Thank you. I was really moved by the retelling of the Angulimala story. I think it highlights, right, for us the complexities of each individual circumstance and an individual's unique causes and conditions, right? And I think that is a good reminder for us, right, to be compassionate, right, to offer grace, right, to others as we offer to ourselves, because we don't know the full story just on a surface reading or on just on face value, right? But I think there are right deeper things going on that we should really delve into, right, in order to truly understand.
Have either of you, growing up Asian, have you experienced sort of any kind of prejudice or discrimination growing up as an Asian? Have you ever had any personal experiences that you would be willing to share?
I'm curious. Yeah. Certainly, yes. I was born in Shanghai, but I immigrated to the US when I was 4 and lived in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area first, and then a suburb of Seattle. So I think, it's complicated, but often a awareness of being other. And, sometimes it could take more violent forms of like racist taunts. And sometimes it just took, and sometimes it was actually realization some people just didn't know anything about Asia, or be like, why do you eat with those funny sticks, or that kind of thing. And I think like in those early childhood interactions of understanding, wow, race is really a complicated part of this country and its fabric, there was sort of an understanding too of, well, I don't need to demonize others. Like there's a way in which like my eating food of a different culture, understanding a different language doesn't have to be a weakness, actually. Like there's a way that I can share. So I think it's like a complicated question. I think there's ways in which I think a lot about. The older I get, the more I think about how complicated race in this country is. And I try to be careful about painting any group as just a victim or just an oppressor. That again, I think as we were talking about earlier, we all have the potential to harm and also cause harm. So I think certainly, I mean, especially after the Atlanta shootings for many Asian American women, remembering times of being sexualized or being harassed, like I can give many examples of that in my life, and those are painful moments, right? And I also think that we're asking a lot of questions also structurally. I mean, vote, right? Everyone please vote. Like that's happening very soon, because there's also structures that can feel bigger than us that result in truly very unequal and racist outcomes. I think that particularly disproportionately affect Black or Brown communities, also, you know, different Asian communities. So Asian is this big, complicated umbrella. It's a whole other story. But I'm curious, Blayne, for yourself, growing up, you know, in Hawaii and in a different context.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so, right? So growing up in Hawaii, we have a very different understanding or different kind of, relationship to race and to racial diversity, since Hawaii is majority minority population here. And so it wasn't until going away to college, to undergrad up in Oregon, actually, in the early 90s, that I experienced, right, this idea of being Japanese American, like naming myself, as, a Japanese American, because in Hawaii, we don't use the American term, right? It's just, we're just Japanese or we're Chinese or, Filipino or whatever, and so it wasn't until I got to Oregon, to school, and, and being a predominantly white space, right? Just the lack of diversity, right? And so really was the ignorance of diversity, which was kind of very telling, right? And, to be asked, oh, you speak English so well. Where did you learn to speak English? Things like that, and in the community, right? Or even at schools at some places, and so, being attuned to that type of othering, right? I think that was my first experience, right? And really it was very profound, right? To understand, right? No, not everybody is alike or understands race the way maybe we do, or but then also was an opportunity to kind of reflect on my own understanding of race and racial disparities. Even within like Hawaii, we have our own issues with race, as well, but maybe not as just different from the continent, right? And so it's very very interesting, right? And I think it's a very complex, like Chenxing mentioned, very complex, and the answers to, the answers to. Oh, so I got a question in the chat.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. So responding to the racism, right? It's like, oh, back then it was just, oh, I was born and raised in Hawaii. And I grew up speaking English, and just kind of really about education and about educating people. But then the funny thing, right, too, is, oh, I'm from Hawaii. Oh, what does that mean, right? Do you use the same money as we do here? Do you, then there's a whole nother level of, of stereotyping and of other types of othering, right? At one time I was in downtown Salem and I was at a shop, and this was like right after the Kobe earthquake. Back then in Japan, and so I was paying with my debit card, and it says Bank of Hawaii, and it says, oh, are you Hawaiian? I'm like, oh no, I'm Japanese. And so, oh, how was the earthquake? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I had no clue. And then I was like, oh, yeah, no, it's fine. I'm not from Japan. So it just. But to constantly have to do that, to constantly have to explain or to, to affirm oneself, right, is exhausting, right? But but being in that space, being in that environment, you just kind of adapt and you learn how to adjust to the situation and how to best represent oneself, right? And where one comes from, right? So yeah. But you know, and when I look back though, there are times I was thinking, really, are you serious? You know, and then, but then, you know, I take the pause, step back, and kind of like, okay, people just don't know sometimes, right? And so, how do we represent? How do we educate? How do we offer ways of understanding, right, with compassion? So, but that's an endless kind of a endless project, right, that each of us has to work with. How to offer compassion, how to offer grace to others, right? Especially in addition to ourselves. So,
Chenxing, did you hear from many individuals that the May We gathering was a very healing, comforting event for them?
We did, yeah. So many people talked about how it was they just had never seen so many people from different religious and different ethnic backgrounds come together and then focused on chanting and ritual and healing. And yeah, I think like this sort of maybe speaks to Chaplain Arun's question as well, which I think is such an important question. I think, you know, there's this question of like, if there's othering or if there's violence, like how to respond in a way that doesn't perpetuate othering and violence. And so to us, thinking about that, making that memorial was a way of like creating a place of refuge or a place of belonging. And for myself, I often look to even like literature and creativity. I mean, even Claudia Rankine's book, which I mentioned, right? She writes so powerfully about racial discrimination, and there's pain in that book, but there's also a lot of beauty and creativity. So yeah, I know what it feels like to feel very tempted to like respond with a kind of either greed or anger or perpetuating ignorance by saying like, oh, like I'm right, they're wrong. I think that's a sort of greed for being right, or by just getting angry, which maybe momentarily feels good, but in the long term probably is not helping the situation. So I think that that's a challenge. And for me, like being rested and being sure that I have spaces of belonging with good friends or spiritual teachers or mentors, that helps. So for myself personally, I can't be in these spaces of othering all the time where I'll become so drained that I then don't have the energy to respond compassionately or skillfully. It's kind of self-care, as we talk about in chaplaincy, is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Right, going back to the well, right, going back to be replenished, right, as a spiritual practice or whatever we do, right, is so important to the work that we do in the world, right, and to be able to balance that, right, because you know, as ministers, as chaplains, as caregivers in the world, you know, we give so much of ourselves, right, and we put so much out there, and to be able to, we have to be able to take that time to replenish, take that time to pause, take that time to rest, in order to be able to be of service, in order to be able to to care again, right, and to continue caring for those in our
Reverend Blaine was in that picture of the Irecho event too, you know, and you helped to represent what camp was that?
So I helped to represent the Kilauea military camp, which was it's a facility here on the Big Island of Hawaii, and it's a place where you know, people often don't realize that there were places of detention here in Hawaii as well, and so KMC was a place where people were sent to temporarily before they were shipped off to other places. Yes, it was quite moving and quite an honor to be able to represent this island, my home, and the history that of this community, and how the war impacted this community as well. So.
Anyone have a question from the chat or they'd like to present? I think we'll probably wrap things up here in a few minutes, but or if you wanted to unmute yourself and present a question, you're welcome to.
Hi, so I have a story that leads into a question.
Okay.
So this week at my job, I work at a spa. I had a client that said to me, you know, people like you and me, we're being replaced. And I already knew exactly where that was coming from. And I'm mixed race. So I was like, okay, do I tell this lady, I'm half Lao, I'm replacing you? Or do I just say nothing, right? So I
Oh,
chose to not change, I just changed the subject, right? So it's like, it's a reflection of her own ignorance, and we're all within our own ignorance. So my question is, like, when is it our job to educate and when is it not?
that's a great question. I guess you have to use your own sort of common sense and judgment in terms of will the educating lead to a confrontation or escalating that ignorance and hatred, or can we educate in a manner that really educates? You know, I guess that's the challenge. Anyone else?
Yeah,
Chinxing
it's
or-
really discerning, right? What is happening, right? What is the underlying story, or it's an opportunity to deepen, on one hand, right, a conversation with an individual, right? In chaplaincy and spiritual care, we talk a lot about deepening the conversation, right? And so it's an opportunity to learn and to listen, right, from them, right? Also, right, before responding, right, or before educating, right? Because I think how we educate should be determined on how the individual wants to be engaged with as well, right? And so we don't know that until we kind of listen. And where is that coming from? Is it really just a racist kind of comment, or is it really or is it something deeper, or just what is the existential fear that individual is expressing? Is it just a political talking point? Is it something, what is it? What's really happening? But right, but we have to discern if we have the energy and the space and the time to be able to engage in that way, right? And so sometimes it's shifting the conversation. Let's just move past it. Other times, maybe, yeah, I'm up for this. Let's figure this out, and let's see where this goes, right?
Yeah.
But then how do we have the conversation? I think that's the important aspect, right? Is it one based on a curiosity and an openness to see where it goes, right, without prejudging, right? I think that's the trick, right? Or are we just trying to respond because we are angry, or because we are kind of offended, or because, how do we, yeah, so.
This is not a racial story, but I don't know why wearing masks has become sort of almost like a political thing, and I was in a public event and I'm wearing my mask, and this guy walks by me without a mask and he says kind of sarcastically, "Nice mask." I knew he was being sarcastic. I wanted to say something, but before I even had a chance to say anything, this person's, I guess, wife hit him and said, "What's the matter with you?" So I didn't have to say anything.
I don't recommend slapping people, in the story that Ricky so kindly shared with us. But yeah, that's such a great question.
Oh, here's a question from Rick. How do we, Jodo Shinshuas, practice the Dharma without leaving an impression of being weak, mindless, fortune cookie minding, where to fight back, showing anger, greed is a sign of being strength and righteousness to a larger population. So do we perpetuate stereotypic images and thoughts ourselves by being nonviolent, or like not saying anything? Any thoughts on that?
I think the practice of nonviolence again is very creative, and I think it contains a lot of strength. So I think there's ways to stand in the Dharma in ways that are actually very strong and impressive. But there's different metaphors one can use, right? I was just thinking yesterday about thinking about a particular interaction. It was like, this one person feels like they are trying to be a knife in this interaction, like they are trying to show how strong they are and trying to just be stabbing. And the other person feels like they're just being water. And so she's like, you can stab water all you want, but nothing really happens. So yes, maybe the knife is stereotypically the more violent and stronger object, but the water over time will wear away that metal and wear away that knife. And so sometimes I think it's also about how do we like redefine and reclaim sort of what does strength even look like? What does strength look like? And I'm thinking still about that particular instance. I think sometimes like theater and play, even with friends, can be really helpful. Like we can probably gather with friends several examples. And sometimes it's quite fun to like role play out just like different scenarios. Like, what does it look like to walk away? What does it look like to say something funny to the person? What does it look like to actually say something angry to the person? And just to test it out. And like when we have that kind of safer container, I think that that's what I think. To me, Buddhism is such a source of strength and creativity. It's not just about dictating that we respond in one way or the other. And what seems strong, a sort of rote response or an addictive response, what sometimes passes as strength in our society, I would actually argue is weak, mindless, maybe fortune cookie minded. I like that.
Yeah. Right. Excellent point. Yeah. Hey, Blayne?
Yeah, Shinran Shonin talks about in his writings, right? A person who lives in Shinjin or in this deep and trusting, right? In this entrusting heart, has a firm and resolute mind and a soft and gentle heart, right? And so that living this path is not weak, right? That there is a certain strength and courage to living, peacefully, living harmoniously, and responding in such a manner, right? And that, and like Chenxing said, like right, there's different ways of being strong, right? And how do we express strength, right? There are times when we have to be firm and not back down and to say that this is wrong, this is unwholesome, this is unwise, right? That is our responsibility as fellow travelers. Other times it's to take a more softer approach, to be more flexible, more supple in how we respond, right? And so I don't think there's any really cookie cutter way of responding to situations, but I think we have to look at the appropriateness of our responses to each situation, and what occasion does it rise to, and how do we rise to that occasion, right? So.
Yeah, very well put. Well, I think maybe that is an excellent point to maybe conclude our session today on. I just want to thank Reverend Blaine and Chenxing for just such a wonderful session today. Thank you for sharing your insights and your reflections on this topic. I think it really pertains to all three poisons, and I think this was a wonderful conclusion to the series that we had on greed, anger, and finally now ignorance. So I'd like to maybe ask everyone to join me in Gasho, and we'll recite the Ninbutsu. Naman Davuts, Naman Davuts, Naman Davuts, Naman Davuts, Naman Davuts, Naman Davuts. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Some of you from great distances and different time zones. We'll let you know what we'll be covering next year. This Living the Dharma Committee is going to be planning some other series of sessions like this for next year. But thank you for supporting the Buddhist Churches of America and our Center for Buddhist Education. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. And once again, thank you so much to Chenxing and Reverend Blaine.